Okay. Right, here we go. 3, 2, 1. Right. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all again, as it were, metaphorically. This is the third of our spring series of Acuity webinars. I'm Steve Smedley, as many of you know. I'd like to introduce Bill Gill, who's a bit of an assurance expert. Many of you may have seen Bill at one of our previous events when everybody had events in the sector. Before I hand over to Bill, just the tedious housekeeping stuff. This webinar is scheduled to last for an hour. We're going to take questions at logical pauses in Bill's presentation. So do think about your questions and use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to post a succinct and to the point question. I'll be sorting through those questions and putting them verbally to Bill to sort of answer at those logical pauses. So this is scheduled to last for an hour. If we overshoot a bit, we overshoot, because it'll probably be useful for you. You can pause it if you want. We are recording this, so it will be available for posterity. Bill's slides will also be available. Both the recording and the slides will be available on our website within the next couple of days or so. I think that's about it from me. But yeah, the only other thing I'd say is I think this, as a job lot, I think Bill's content that we're going to cover shortly will be a really good complement to Sam McGrady's presentation that she did this time last week on risk. I think the two things sit alongside each other very nicely. So that's it. Enough from me. Bill, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. So yes, so today we're looking at the consumer standards. What does good assurance look like? Tiny bit about myself, but sort of one of my key roles now is chairing the Group Audit Risk Committee at Bolton at Home. So what I'm hoping to cover this morning is to consider the changing face of consumer regulation. I'm sure all of you will have been bombarded with correspondence from the regulator over the last few years, and we'll look at that. And I tried to identify some of the key messages from the regulator. And then in the second half, we're going to be looking at trying to understand how assurance can be obtained and appreciate how assurance can assist in meeting the regulator's requirements. And those of you who did attend sort of Sam's session around risk, be well aware that obviously, potentially for all of us, a key risk is not meeting the regulator's standards. And when you drive down into that detail, things like health and safety and tenant safety are really big risks for all of our organisations. So hopefully there should be some crossover there. So I think the first thing really to say when we come to consumer standards is we've not to forget the context. And obviously Grenfell, the dreadful incident at Grenfell was appalling for the sector as a whole. And I know there's lots of people can be blamed and other organisations involved, including the government. But we shouldn't forget that people lost their lives in that incident. And then obviously just recently, ITV have been doing their bit for putting social housing ever firmly into the spotlight. That's sort of Clarence Estate in Mitcham in South London, and both of those incidents just really dragged the reputation of social housing through the mud, and obviously has been a real driver for everything that has come since. So in terms of background, where do we go? We had, back in November 2020, we had the Charter for Social Housing, the Housing Residents, the white paper, and clearly that was driven very much by Grenfell, and it was very focused around building safety and also the residents' voice, which we'll hear a lot more about. And then obviously since then, the regulator's been giving us little drips of further information. So back in November last year, they issued their Reshaping Consumer Regulation sort of leaflet, which I'm sure all of you read, which basically just gave everyone a prompt as to where things were going. But I think a key message all the way through all of this is they always hark back to the white paper. And basically the white paper was almost like the red line for government in terms of this is what we're expecting from social landlords. And therefore, all of the extra information that the regulators issued does sort of say, this is just a bit more information, but you should already be doing this. So then in December, we got the consultation on the introduction of tenant satisfaction measures. So another 3-letter acronym, first of all, TSMs, which I'm sure in the next few years will be becoming as common as that, you know, RSH and all the others. And then in April, Fiona very kindly wrote to us all, just highlighting that they are still working on all this new consumer regulation. There's obviously going to be a piece of legislation coming out, but just to remind us all that we should be getting on and doing this and not to wait for sort of the final documents. And then obviously the social housing regulation bill, which is expected in the summer. And I think one of the issues, and Steve and I were just talking about this before he let you all into the Zoom meeting. We can sometimes in the sector get a bit like an echo chamber. And I found this particularly over, you know, and social media in particular does this, but also workplaces. You've all got similar sort of views. And we saw this a lot with Brexit. You know, in terms of people with particular views were surrounded by people with those same views, and therefore we all sort of went, oh yes, whichever viewpoint you took, this was, you know, this, we were going to be fine, we were either going to stay or we we're going to leave. And I think the sector sees itself doing a really good job in demanding circumstances. I know the organisations I work with do a very good job in demanding circumstances, but not all the time. And I think when you drill down to, you know, there's a lot of talk about sort of big data and sort of driving down into sort of, you know, granular issues. When you get down to the nitty gritty, which as a board member myself, you often don't do, not everything is as rosy as it may first appear. And I think the TV program around Clarion really highlighted that. But a question, a sort of a rhetorical question, really, rather than for you to definitely answer now, is can any of you categorically state that you have no tenants with any valid reasons for being dissatisfied in your properties at this moment in time? And I doubt whether any chief executive or chair of a housing association can sort of put their hand on their heart and say, all of my tenants are living in perfect properties, there's no issues at all, and they're all perfectly happy. There's no, you know, issues with mold. There's no delays with, you know, existing repairs, or particularly with sort of, you know, the program planned improvement repairs that obviously particularly were backlogged during COVID, or tenants not happy with their environment, their neighborhood, because they've got, you know, really difficult tenant with antisocial behavior living next door to them. And so I think clearly some providers, and it often is the very large ones, obviously, like Clarion and some of the councils that have let their tenants down. And that's obviously the regulator's been tasked with addressing that issue. But one of the things I'd like you to, all the way through today's session, is just think about, no one is perfect. I'm sure Steve and I would both agree. We definitely haven't been perfect always in our careers, but it's something for providers to think about. So we've got this new bill coming along shortly. What do we know? Well, there's certain things that we know are going to be in there. We already know that the regulator and the Housing Ombudsman have started to cooperate. That's going to be in the bill. Safety is going to be specifically added to the regulator's objectives. I mean, it was technically there, obviously, when you read the home standard, but it's going to be emphasised, and obviously it links with the new building safety regulator the HSE is setting up. Providers need to appoint a health and safety lead. There's going to be a lot more performance information being collected around the sort of tenant satisfaction measures. But a couple of things that I picked up, and there wasn't. The first one is that obviously there's now unlimited fines for non-compliance. Now, I'm not sure many people were aware that in the previously you could be fined £5,000, up to £5,000 for non-compliance. Now, having worked with a lot of organisations who were downgraded, including the board that I currently sit on, no one's ever been fined. As far as I'm aware, no one has ever been fined. And when you take in the cost of coming out of being downgraded to get back to being compliant with particularly the governance and financial viability standard, a £5,000 fine fades into insignificance compared to the costs associated with becoming compliant. But now the regulator has the ability to do unlimited fines. They also, there was the possibility they could actually do an emergency survey. If there's properties were found to be in a poor state of condition, they could ask for emergency surveys to be carried out. You would be given at least a month for this. Now it's down to just 2 days. And if there are significant failings, there's a requirement for the provider to complete a performance improvement plan. But there's also quite a few things that we don't know. Now, clearly there's going to be an enhanced focus on health and safety. We don't know the detail of this, but obviously it's quite clearly the building safety regulator has a role in this as well. What we do know is that the serious detriment test around the consumer standards will be dropped and there will be proactive regulation. But again, we're not sure what this will be. But as the regulator's been running its IDA, its in-depth assessment program, very successfully over the last few years, they did their first rounds of IDAs. They're now on to the second round. It's working well, having been through 2 IDAs and with the association where I'm on the board. It's a very challenging process, but I think it's a very fair process and it's good learning for organisations as well. I suspect that what they come up with is not going to be too different. And personally speaking, when Bolton had their last IDA, which was in 2020, already there were questions that generally used to be very much around finance, governance, risk. It was very much governance, financial viability, obviously the rent standard and the value for money standard. We were getting asked questions, not myself personally as chair of audit. All my questions, thankfully, were on audit and risk. But the chair and the chief executive and officers were starting to get asked questions around consumer-related elements, mostly around building safety, so fire safety in particular for some of our tower blocks, the tenant's voice element, so complaints and how the board were finding out what the tenant's view of the organisation was. So I think that's where we'll be going. And I think some of the things we can assume, I think it will remain risk focused. I mean, obviously the key element will be very much around sort of health and safety issues. There'll be, again, the focus on outcomes, and that's worked quite well with the regulatory standards as they are, where the regulator sets out a sort of this is what we want, and we leave you, or they leave us, the landlords, to decide how we're going to meet those outcomes. So if hopefully you've all read the regulatory standards in detail, they're not prescriptive at all. They basically get, you need to have, a risk management system in place. You need to gain assurance. You need to do this. You need to do that. You need to offer your tenants, an ability to, mutually exchange all those sort of things. But how you do that is very much left up to yourselves, and it will be proportionate as well. So for the vast majority of you who are under 1,000 units, the detail, you can go, well, it's not really an issue for us. We're not going to have an in-depth assessment. But we can't forget about this. And as you've seen with the tenant satisfaction measures, although obviously it's more onerous for the larger associations who have got to obviously publish and do everything else, we still, smaller landlords have still got to collect that data and put it on a website so for our tenants can see. So we mentioned about the timelines. Obviously, I mentioned about the social housing regulation bill. April 2023, we're going to have the TSMs coming in, and then it's probably going to be 2024 before the full updated sort of regulatory standards for the consumer standards comes into play. But again, just to quote Fiona McGregor, they don't want people to wait until 2024 to start making changes. And you can see the direction of travel all the way through the white paper, obviously when the regulation bill comes out, all of that, and the noises the regulators making, it's quite clear that there's certain themes that they're concentrating on: safety, quality, talk about neighborhoods. A key one is transparency, and I'm sure in some of the other sessions that Q2 running, you'll start to get more and more of that coming through. I think if you were playing sort of certain regulatory bingo at the recent finance conference, when the regulator's speaking, I know Jonathan Walters in his session, transparency cropped up numerous times. And then you've got engagement, accountability, and tenancy, and obviously the engagement element in terms of that resident's voice. It's really clear that the regulator is expecting us to step up. So some of the key messages, obviously I've mentioned all of these really. I think tackling poor performance is something, driving up standards, that we all can do. I don't think there's any one of us can say our organisations are doing everything brilliantly. We can all continue to improve. But I think the key message that I took away from all of the sessions that the regulator's done of late is we should already be doing all of this. Yes, when you look at Grenfell, there were particular issues over fire doors and such like, and they were following building regulations, etc., etc. But when you saw the conditions of the estate in Mitcham, Clarence Estate, and then later on when they did that investigation into Croydon, people shouldn't live in conditions like that. There's none of that was sort of acceptable. If you're a social landlord with the ethics and the ethos that our sector has, we shouldn't be allowing our tenants to live in properties like that. And I think that's sort of key. And so what that does is it brings us back to some of those co-regulatory principles that the regulator set out way back when the regulatory standards framework came into play. And I think it's useful just to remind ourselves of these, because particularly some small organisations that have then crossed over the line became sort of more into mainstream regulation when they crossed over 1,000 units. There was an element of, well, the regulator, so they're the ones who tell us that we're doing okay. And co-regulation is not like that. We, the landlords, are responsible for meeting the regulatory standards, and in fact, it's the board's responsibility. So as a board member myself, me and my colleagues are responsible for ensuring that Bolton at Home meet the regulatory standards. And we are the ones that have to get that information, that assurance that we're meeting the standards. And what the regulator then does is it challenges us on the assurance that we've gained. And is it adequate? Are we getting the right level of assurance? Is it from the right sources? So that's where the challenge and in-depth assessment comes from. But the other elements are, we as landlords should be supporting our tenants to help shape and scrutinise our service delivery. And what this means is it's not gone are the days of the paternalistic social landlord. It's not for us to just go, this is what we're going to do. Tenants need to be engaged with so that they can help develop and improve the services they receive. And a key element of co-regulation is that when we're not meeting those standards, we should inform the regulator. And you could say it's a bit like MPs watching porn in the House of Commons and then referring themselves to the Standards Committee. I can assure you that having been there with our regulator, they're a lot tougher than the Standards Commissioner at the Houses of Commons. But I know organisations who have potentially got away with breaching the standard but not informing the regulator. When you're small, it's a risk you can take and you might get away with it. When you're a large organisation, I would strongly recommend not following that course of action, because having been through 2 IDAs at Bolton in quite a lot of detail, they're very good. I have to admit, the regulator staff are a lot sharper and knowledgeable than those of you who remember the corporation back in the 90s, where, you know, one of the fun and games was, well, we used to run, you know, when they used to come in and ask for loads of information, we used to just run rings around them and, you know, make sure they didn't find out anything of interest. Gone are those days. They're much sharper. So something to bear in mind. So in terms of co-regulation, there have been some changes, but there's also the principles stay. So I think the primary relationship is between the landlord and the tenant. And that's what the regulator is expected to see. And I know it's challenging, you know, for small providers. You know, one of my clients I work with currently has sort of 40 tenanted properties, about 60 shared ownership. Not a big organisation, and it is a challenge trying to get tenants and leaseholders engaged. They just basically want a nice house. They've got a nice house, and they're more than happy. Standards are obviously have always been non-prescriptive and they're going to remain so. But what we're going to see is, unlike previously, the regulator is now going to have a whole host of performance data, which obviously those of you who are over 1,000 units, so maybe 1 or 2 of you in the audience, when you move to over 1,000 units, there's a whole host of other returns that you provide. The statistical data return becomes a major piece of work. For instance, you've got the quarterly surveys, but they're all focused on rents. It's all the finance, the economic standards. The TSMs are going to give the regulator a whole host of operational performance data, and that's going to be really helpful for them. But co-regulation is very much, it's the regulator's early warning system. If a provider is getting into difficulties, they should be going to the regulator, and it's part of their risk management that they come forward and say, we've got particular issues. So are there, as sort of very much a whistle-stop tour of what's been going on with the regulator in terms of consumer standards and possible changes. Are there any questions at that point? Because obviously we're now going to move into looking at assurance and how we gain assurance. So
yeah, thanks, Bill. Just remind people to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens to post your questions. We've just got 1 question so far from David Nugent. Picking up on the unlimited fines that you referred to. He's just saying, you know, what do those unlimited fines look like? Who's assuring proportionality? If there's no checks and balances, might this not unduly worry lenders or funders?
It may well do, David. It slipped in. If you there was a web page that I found which summarized the key changes, proposed changes in the bill if it passes through, and there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no signs that it's not going to get passed. No one seems to be up in arms about anything that's in there. Yes, unlimited fines may cause concern, but then again, I just point out that under GDPR, there's potential unlimited fines as well, in terms of the Information Commission Office, that, you know, if you breach data protection regulations and lose a load of your personal data, you could have a significant fine, as what's it, 4% of your turnover or something. So yes, there is a potential for that. As we've seen, the regulator hasn't in the past looked to fine associate. There's been so many cases of non-compliance. Not a single one has been fined though. I suspect it's, and don't quote me on this, but because it might annoy some of my friends at the regulator, it potentially a money-making scheme for the government, by including unlimited fines, and particularly if they find big associations with deep pockets, you know, you're already paying a fee to the regulator for them very kindly coming around and checking up on you as you provide them with lots of information. I see this purely as a warning shot across the bows to providers to go, well, we won't just downgrade you, potentially you could get a big fine as well. But also, if it's quite serious, I think you may see some associations getting a fine, purely just to, again, add some coffers into the regulator's, you know, pocket, really.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is, in some ways, it could actually provide more assurance to lenders and investors, in that it's another tool in a well-legislated, well-regulated sector that's going to keep providers on the straight and narrow. I think the other thing is, with any of these things, there's almost like an ethical question to be considered by a regulator or even a government issuing fines, or, you know, the legal system, is that you're essentially taking money out of the out of social housing. So it's actually tenants rents that would be paying for the fine. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all that comes out in the wash.
I was going to say, I don't think there's with the current government anyway, I don't think there's an ethical issue about taking money off councils or housing providers at all, unfortunately.
No.
But yes, but thanks for that, David. It's something to sort of to bear in mind. So can we now look at sort of assurance, and just to give you an idea of assurance that. So this is your chief exec, you're a board member, and they go, it's fine, don't worry, trust me, it's all going to be fine. Immediately, you're starting to ask questions. And this is what assurance is all about, that you shouldn't take things on face value, unlike numerous Western governments have for the last 20 years. But, you know, I could talk about using an animal analogy. Bears don't change their spots, but there you go. So what actually is assurance, and maintaining the current affairs sort of analogy? That's and I did remember the name of the missile defense system. It's one of the ones that the West has provided to Ukraine, and obviously it's got radar and it can shoot down incoming missiles. It's meant to be really good. So what is assurance? Well, an assurance statement itself is intended to inspire confidence. Assurance is a freedom from doubt. And what assurance really is what regulators and external agencies are looking for from us as housing associations, that we're being well run. And if you're a board member in an association, it's assurance that your officers are doing a good job and complying with laws and regulations and such like. But the thing to remember is, as with this missile system, defense system in the picture, it can only provide reasonable assurance. Nothing is 100%. So any of you who are football fans out there will know, you know, things can go wrong. You should have won that game, but there's always a bit of luck in all of these things. So An assurance activity is an activity that provides objective and impartial information or an opinion relating to the adequacy and effectiveness of the processes and procedures in furtherance of the organisation's objectives, which is load of gobbledygook for those of you who aren't sort of internal auditors and such like. In simple terms, what this is everything that you as an officer of your association does, which results in you confirming to a board member, to your line manager, to the regulator or other agencies like the Housing Ombudsman or the HSE or whatever, that what you've done is correct and effective. So every housing association has a range of sort of strategic objectives, and assurance is the way of confirming that the organisation is actually achieving those objectives. And normally we look at this in terms of risk. So what you have, and I'm sure Sam covered this in her session, is you'll all have your objectives, which may be, building houses, providing quality service to your tenants, making sure the properties, meet safety requirements. So you've got these objectives. There's risks, some of them financial, some of them operational, to achieving those objectives. And assurance is those activities that basically evidence to the people who need to know that the risks are being managed and that the activity is going to be, it will help achieve those objectives. So here's some examples of sources of assurance. So these activities would give me as a board member comfort that things are going well. Potentially, obviously, if the internal audit, for instance, flagged up that there's loads of issues, it doesn't give you the assurance. It gives you assurance that you know that there are things wrong, and then you have to do something about it. And the same with all of these. So you can get negative assurance as well as positive assurance, but all of these are potential sources. Obviously, internal audit, as an auditor myself, I think is really helpful because it gives an independent insight. All the rest are internal insights, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Risk management activities, quality assurance systems, management reports and assurances, performance management, and even board oversight. All of these provide some source of assurance for you. But I think specifically when we look at the consumer standards, there's other elements that sort of spring to mind. These are very much your core assurance sources that if I was doing a presentation on audit, risk and assurance, these would crop up, and your board should be asking for all of these in relation to, your financial systems, your rent system and such like, to get comfort that it's all working well. So assurance in terms of consumer standards, I think a number of the things sort of come into play. External accreditations are really useful. So obviously, a number of you may have Chartermark, for instance, complaints management, having a good system of resident scrutiny, making sure the tenant's voice is heard. Obviously, we're now going to have these tenant satisfaction measures, which the regulator is bringing in, and that's going to provide a huge amount of data, which obviously you can use internally to gain assurance that things are going well. But also, I think governance arrangements, far too many, and I appreciate it's a struggle for small organisations, but far too many small organisations that I've worked with in the past have gone, oh, we're quite small, we just don't get the tenants involved, we can't get the tenants involved, and they don't look to come up with innovative ways of getting that sort of tenant voice architecture into their governance arrangements, whether that be, as a tenant board member even, and providing assistance so that people feel engaged and able to put themselves forward. But I think assurance is also moving with the times. And I'm not sure how much of this people will be aware of, but you can now build in these sort of continuous auditing and control systems. So with sort of really good software packages, there's a certain element of ongoing auditing. Say, for instance, with a rent system, for instance, it would sort of continually reconcile to make sure that you're all up to date. You've also, with particularly some of the new performance management systems out there, almost got real-time data. So one of my clients basically outsourced their housing management to another organization, and they're able to, the end of each day, download a report from this software, Power BI, and basically gives them the latest information on their properties in terms of rent, repairs, etc. Data analytics, I won't go into any detail, but any of you who've been at some of the conferences now that they're back up and running, but even pre-COVID, data analytics was the big thing, analysing, collecting the right data to enable us to make decisions, but then analysing it to really understand themes, and using it in a much more innovative way so that you really understand what your customers want from you as a social landlord. Customer scrutiny reports, but I now start to see, I know it's in some of the larger organizations, but customer scrutiny being carried out, supported by internal audit to really improve the quality of that. And then having outcome focused performance monitoring. So not just having a whole range of performance indicators, but what the outcomes we're really looking for. And particularly this is around in terms of improving the lot of our tenants. And a lot of social landlords talk about improving the welfare for tenants, but not having the metrics that really show that. So as a board member, I think don't overlook your board need assurance on what do you give them. And in far too many cases, it's officers just going, yes, everything's fine. But boards can't take everything on trust. And if that's the only assurance that you're getting, the regulator will be concerned, because clearly there's that whole echo chamber potential issue there. If it's just management saying everything's fine and the board going, yeah, that's okay, and not challenging it, what other evidence do you get? And having been on a board which had a health and safety issue because of some data, so a number of properties did not have their gas boilers serviced for a couple of years because of the way the data was collected and went into a different part of the system. And suddenly, once that happens, you start questioning everything that comes forward. So every performance indicator got drilled down to make sure that the board really understood what that meant. So when you get performance indicators on, say, rent arrears, some associations, I know, actually deduct the potential housing benefit that is due in the month, because they go, well, we know we're going to get that money, so we knock it off, whereas others don't. And the lack of consistency, and Steve and I have both worked for Housemarque in the past. We know that data collection is a real issue when you're looking to compare yourself with other organisations in terms of consistency of data collection. There's also ability to what we call triangulate evidence, and it's a bit like doing a jigsaw, that if you get the edges done first, and then it's much easier to slot the other bits in. And it's like that as a board member, that if you get one piece of evidence from one part of the business telling you X, if another part of the business also tells you X, and then an external organization says X as well, then it's all going to be X's. And this is what the regulator does. And a lot of organizations that have had investigations will have found that they sent a piece of information in, say, on their SDR, and then the regulator checked that against either their accounts or their quarterly survey and found there was a difference. And that's what, they then come and investigate. So triangulating can give you a bit of a reality check. Is all the information actually in place? But the thing to remember, although it does give comfort, assurance is there's no 100% guarantee. And the regulator's not expecting that either. In my discussions when I've been interviewed by the regulator in an idea around being a chair of audit, the argument is, we don't have the resources to audit everything every year. So you have to take a judgment on the key risk areas that you want to have some assurance on. And they're happy with that. They know that, organizations, it has to be proportionate. You can't cover everything. So a quick question, and I don't know, in terms of show of hands or whatever, but do you self-assess against the regulatory standards? And when I say self-assess, what I'm saying is, do you do reports to your board every year confirming that you comply with all of the standards, and where you don't comply, you identify sort of a little action plan of things that need to be, improved upon for the following year? Anyone want to just drop a sort of a yes, no in the Q&A, just to give Steve an idea of numbers? How are we looking, Steve?
There's some coming through now. They're all yeses. We're up to 3 yeses so far. So,
well, that's
yeah,
positive. That's positive. Hopefully, they're all organisations that I've done some work with. So, I think a key. I'm not asking anyone to say no, they don't. So don't worry about that. But in terms of good practice, this has been a particular bugbear issue for me over the recent past. I have done work with a lot of small registered providers over the years, and recently I've ended up doing bits of work with some small RPs, and they have not undertaken any self-assessment against the regulatory standards. So just to put that in context, as a provider, in your annual accounts, you should state that you comply with the governance and financial viability standards. So the one requirement that we all have within within our accounts is to confirm that we comply with the governance and financial viability standard. But within the governance and financial viability standard, I think it's 1.2 or 1.3, says that, ensure that the provider complies with all laws and regulations. Well, that basically means then that by confirming you comply with the governance and financial viability standard, you also comply with all the other standards. And the board signs off. The chair is the person who signs off those accounts. The board are going, yes, we're happy with this. So in essence, what's happening is the board are confirming that they comply with all the regulatory standards. But I have seen a number of small registered providers where there is no evidence presented to the board throughout the year that that is the case. So in terms of good practice, and I know, obviously, and to be honest, it doesn't always happen in some of the larger associations from what I've seen as well, but I would recommend that every provider carries out an annual self-assessment against all the regulatory standards, both the economic and consumer, even though obviously in the past, the consumer standards weren't being proactively regulated, but it was useful. And basically you can learn and go, oh, actually, we're not really doing this. So you develop an improvement plan. And that improvement plan then also is evidence of continuous improvement. So I think that it can be useful if you do have any regulatory engagement to sort of evidence that, you're improving with, not just taking the standards and go, well, we're not going to, we've done it once, that's it. But every year you look at, well, how can we deliver these outcomes better? And there have been changes, particularly in terms of, new housing software enables much more sort of flexibility. Even a lot of small providers now have tenant portals on their software, where tenants can go in and pay their rent, to do lots of things that you can then add in terms of achieving your outcomes. Because I think we mustn't forget, could this be your tenant? Have you got properties with a massive hole in the roof and that tenants living in those sorts of conditions? So when you look at the sort of, the landlord-tenant relationship, which is key all the way through the consumer standards, how confident are you about that relationship, particularly if you're a senior officer or a board member? This relationship is key to meeting the consumer standards. It's all about that, tenants coming and saying, we're not happy with this, and you dealing with it. When it comes to what really do your tenants think of you as an organization? I know lots of small associations who basically don't do any real ongoing customer feedback. They will do their star survey every 3 years, and in the intervening period, literally nothing, maybe repair feedback forms, and that's about it. So what assurance is your board getting in that period that the relationship is good? Or maybe this is your approach to complaints, which hopefully you can see that quite clearly as a hand grenade, because complaints also are a key element now of consumer regulation. There's detailed requirements from the Housing Ombudsman. How many of you, for instance, have on your website your self-assessment against the Ombudsman's new handling code? I know a number of small providers still haven't put it on their website. And complaints, if you identify themes and trends and you improve the reporting around complaints, it's really useful information. We can analyze those complaints better. And then it's that whole panacea of maximizing the use of this big data that, if you identify themes, you can start to sort of deal with fundamental issues instead of tackling the individual, the minutiae of an individual tenant's complaints. You start to see themes.
Just a quick heads up, Bill. 10 minutes, yeah?
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah, okay.
And then you've got resident scrutiny coming to the fore. So we all know, poor performance is often a sign of either weak controls or management cultural issues. And I think that where you see really good performing organizations, they're really self-aware about their strengths and their weaknesses, and they're quite happy to use the residents and say, come on, tell us what we're doing badly and let us work together in improving it. But I've also seen providers that just don't want to do that. They're quite happy. They think they're doing a good job, and we don't, we're not really interested in what the tenants think of us at. And I think that, I know it's a challenge for smaller providers, but there's some really good examples out there of small providers working with their tenants and residents and really adding value to the organization and the processes. Now it's a bit like, if any of you listen to Elaine Page on Sunday, she always plays one of her songs, which I think is incredibly narcissistic. But obviously, doing an acuity presentation, there has to be at least one side on benchmarking. I'm sure it was somewhere in the small print of the contract, wasn't there, Steve? So just a tiny bit on benchmarking. A benchmark is also, and obviously we'll see this with tenant satisfaction measures, really useful form of assurance. How are you performing? And when you start benchmarking some of those sorts of satisfaction measures, it will give you an insight into how well you comply with the consumer standards. How come some of your peer group have much lower level of complaints than you do? drill down what type of complaints. Is it all around repairs? Is it we've got a problem with our repairs? And then one of the things, having worked with lots of smaller organizations, you are much better than, you know, the larger associations now. I know we've got the G15 and all this, but they don't really talk to one another on that sort of level. It's all very, you know, strategic sort of. When I've worked with small organizations, you know people in your peer group really well. And the opportunity then to sort of really sit down and really understand the variations in your performance. And that can really help drive continuous improvement. So there is a value on assurance, but one of the things to remember is that any assurance loses value over time. It's a bit like keeping food in your fridge. Initially, it's very fresh, but over time, it will start to go off, no matter how good your fridge is. And that's the same with assurance, that you may have got assurance that everything is tickety-boo in 2020, but we're now in 2022. When was the last time you looked at these areas? So it does need to be updated and reassessed. And one thing I can really stress to you, having a lot of the organizations I've worked with over the last 10 years, generally I end up getting work when someone's got into trouble with the regulator. It seems to be the big income generator for consultancies, people getting into trouble. So it's a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas, me encouraging you not to get into trouble with the regulator. But it's a lot cheaper you spending some money getting assurance in the first place than dealing with regulatory engagement. And there's lots of associations out there that will confirm that, because the regulator is getting much better at picking up issues. And obviously we're going to be giving them all that TSM information and everything else. It's going to be even easier for them to spot things. So quality assurance is not a magician. It may appear that way, but it's not a panacea. It doesn't give you everything. So in terms of good practice, you need to get your boards involved in the process. You need to regularly challenge data, any of the assurances you get, and management. A documented self-assessment provides all of the evidence you really need. But obviously on top of that, you've got benchmarking, performance indicators, sort of other quality sort of feedback, external accreditations and the like. And all of this helps the board also to better understand the business so they can identify issues before they escalate. So those of you who are big Disney fans, hopefully will recognize this. So we all need someone who's going to tell us it as it really is. And referring back to my echo chamber slide, I think there is a bit of an issue that as a board member, we don't always have that. We have officers telling us what we want to hear, not what really is going on. And if you try doing that with the regulator, you're going to come a cropper. So to wrap up, consumer regulation is happening. It's happening soon. Are you ready for it? Assurance is not total. It never will be. There's always a risk of error, but obviously it improves your chances of keeping yourself out of the regulatory gaze. And we do need to involve customers more, get a better understanding of their views. And for me personally, going back to obviously Snow White and the Wicked Queen, self-awareness is really the new scrutiny. You as an organization, you as officers need to be able to look and go, that's not good enough. We're not meeting the standard in this way. What we're going to do about it. So we all need someone to tell you how good you really are. And as an internal auditor, I can strongly recommend internal auditors are very good at telling you that you're not very good at times. So hopefully an opportunity for some thoughts, comments, questions, and the like.
Thanks, Bill. It's a really good canter through, I think, some of the key principles and what people need to think about, and picking up very much on that. Imtiaz from down in Leicester, or up in Leicester, if you from the south, is saying, is there a checklist in place that could be shared regarding compliance with the standards? I think he's after some of your free consultancy handouts there.
Well, see, what I can tell you is that the regulator has rather given you a bit of a checklist now, which is basically the standards broken down each section into a spreadsheet, and you put in what evidence you have. A consultancy whose name I shall not repeat on this webinar basically made loads of money out of consultancy when the regulatory standards came into play in the first place. And that's all they did for their self-assessments. They just basically went through the standards. Obviously, with value for money and the governance of financial viability standards, you also have the code of practice as well. So you literally have two columns. You have what's the standard is, and then it provides a lot more detail in the code of practice. But that is basically all there is, because the regulator will turn around and go, it's not for us to decide if that's good enough. It's for you, the landlord, and your board. Are you meeting the standard? And in terms of the compliance with all regulations and laws, there is a huge variation. I know a number of providers who annually pay solicitors a large sum of money to basically do a check that they've picked up any new legislation in the past 12 months has been picked up either in policies and procedures, and people are aware of it and such like. So it is can be quite onerous, but there are shortcuts. Use the regulatory standards, talk to other people in other associations, and I'm sure somebody somewhere will share something with you. I'm sure that my colleagues at Bolton at Home are very good. We like doing things that are belt and braces. It's incredibly detailed what we get as board members in terms of our self-assessment. But we're very generous as well. And I know that my officers at Bolton have quite often, particularly with smaller associations, have quite often shared bits of information. So if anybody did want anything, if they contact Steve, he can email me. I can have a word with all my friends at Bolton, and I'm sure we can let you have a look at an example that's out there. But it's not really a checklist, because what you need to remember, particularly around the consumer standards, everyone is different. No two registered providers are exactly the same. And when you approach, they're all outcome based. So you may decide to deliver that outcome in a slightly different way to another association. And I do like that about it. What it does mean is also you can't just crib what everyone else is doing. Otherwise, every housing association in the country is going to end up being run and looking exactly the same.
Yeah, brilliant, Bill. I think that would be great if you could give us, if we could snaffle a copy of whatever Bolton at Home does. But yeah, I'd just like to reiterate what Bill said. I think it's very easy with things like regulatory standards to knock up your very, very own quick compliance checklist just by having, a couple of 3 columns with headline statements from standards. And if a standard is supported by a code of practice, you've got more to go at. It wouldn't surprise me if, when the consumer standards are finalized in 2024, that we do have a few codes of practice to sit alongside them. But as Bill says, I think you can very easily knock them up yourself, but they mean nothing unless you look at what each one of the principles within the standards, what that actually means in your own image, what it means for your business and the way that you provide your services. But yeah, a great starting point would be Bolton at Homes. Right, Duncan.
And a quick little addition to that is, and then within those checklists, people record the evidence. So we do this, we do that, and then what as a board member, what you're looking for is, well, how do I know as a board? So you are in my checklist, I add an assurance column, and this is where organisations then start to struggle. How does the board member know that we're doing this? What information is the board getting that we're handling complaints well or whatever?
That's it. So you've got the principle of the point that you're trying to look against compliance. You've got another column that says evidence to back it up. So it's evidence-based. You might even have a score, a score that comes out of that. And like you say, I think and it really massively ties into the subject matter of this, which is what forms of assurance are you giving either the board or the exec that is indeed the position. Right, we're gonna crack on because we're running out of time. I love Duncan's question. It's that one: should we or shouldn't we on the compliance side of things? He says, we do an annual self-assessment and improvement plan. Is it okay to confirm compliance where there are areas of partial compliance and areas to address? So it's whether you should fess up or not.
It's one of those difficult ones. It's like he's got Jiminy Cricket on your shoulder going, oh, you should do it. So my personal view, and I've done this with a lot of small providers. A lot of small providers don't always comply 100%. And the question is the regulator even going to be worried about this? One, no, they're not going to be worried. If it's only sort of, some minor areas, if it hasn't resulted in either a financial loss or a tenant or tenants have been placed in danger, then I wouldn't bother with it. Particularly if you're a small organisation that's not really growing, you're never going to go over the 1,000 units, or not for a considerable length of time. If you're on 950 units, you've got a development programme of 60 units, so you're going to be over 1,000 units in the next 12 months. The regulator, when they do their first IDA, can look back 3 years, and clearly there's potential. If it goes as a board paper and it evidences that we're not fully compliant, then it's a much more challenging discussion of, do we then fess up? And my general view is I would do it on the basis that it's better to fess up than for them to find it. Because if you try and hide it, I'm sure they will. Someone will send the wrong document and they'll come across it. And they have been known to be lenient, shall we say, in depending on the degree. Obviously, if it's 50 houses that you've not serviced the gas boiler for 12 months, they tend not to see that in a very proportionate way. And I know associations who have had a really challenging engagement with the regulator, things like that. If it's actually we haven't got a mutual exchange program in place and we should have thought about that and done something about that, I think they may be more lenient on that. And things like resident scrutiny, we're putting things in place, but I wouldn't say we completely tick all the necessary boxes. So I think you need to make that judgment from being proportionate. But if you are close to being going over the limit and being IDA'd, be very cautious if you don't tell them.
And yeah, I mean, certainly any conversations I've had with the regulator and stuff, I think if anybody's got any doubts and they don't want to express something in writing, i.e. in the accounts, about the extent of their compliance, they can always give the regulator a tinkle. And I think that they're doing it sort of verbally over the phone, and the regulator can kind of give them a bit of a steer. And like you say, I think they appreciate organisations that may have spotted something and just want to discuss it with them in the first instance. Okie dokes. We're kind of out of time. Andrew Furtex just asked about any practices, any good practice examples of self-assessment. I think we've just been discussing that, and we're going to try and snaffle bolt-ons, which would be fab. So I think that's it. It just remains for me to say, Bill, thanks so much, because I know you put a lot of time and effort into this. It really is good to get the perspective of somebody that immerses themselves in assurance, but somebody that's on the sharp end, sitting on an audit and risk committee as well. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve, for inviting me.
No worries. And I'd just like to say thank everybody for attending as well. Do check out our website for our remaining webinars. We've already got some good feedback coming in on the session, Bill. So
Good.
That's it. Great. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you at a future one of these shortly. Goodbye.
Thanks. Are you staying on for a minute, Steve?
I have to knock it off, but I'll give you a quick tinkle.